Imagine walking into a perfect replica of your home. The fire is still smoldering, the dinner plates are set, your favorite book is open face down on the chair. But the people? They have vanished. Poof, gone. This is the chilling, absolute truth behind America's very first ghost story, the lost colony of Roanoke. It began with dreams in 1587. 117 English settlers landed on the Carolina coast, driven by the fierce hope of establishing England's first permanent foothold in the New World. They struggled, yes, against the heat, the lack of supplies, and the complex, often volatile interactions with the local Native American tribes. But they were surviving. They were building. This wasn't just a mission, it was the birth of a nation, and every single person there carried that immense weight. Then came the panic. Governor John White, who had briefly sailed back to England for essential supplies, returned in 1590, 3 years later. What he found wasn't a thriving community, it was silence. The scene must have been utterly paralyzing. The fortified settlement was completely deserted. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, nothing burned to the ground. Just empty houses, their doors swaying slightly in the breeze. And the bizarre sight of personal belongings, tools, furniture, even precious family items, left precisely where they belonged, as if the settlers had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. It's an eerie kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. It shouts that something catastrophic happened, but whispers no details. And then one single terrifying clue. Carved deep into the palisade post, not far from where the settlers had vanished, was a single word: Croatoan. Was it a sign of relocation? Were they seeking refuge with the nearby native tribe of the same name? Or was it a chilling warning of a darker fate? We are about to dive into the abyss, searching for evidence that the authorities have been suppressing for 400 years. That single word, Croatoan, isn't just a scribble on a tree. It's the oldest, most baffling cipher in American history. When John White found it, he initially felt a surge of relief. Why? Because before he left for England, the settlers had agreed on a protocol. If they relocated, they would carve the name of their new destination. But critically, if they were forced out by danger or violence, they were supposed to carve a Maltese cross above the word. There was no cross. So, in White's mind, this confirmed they hadn't been massacred. They had simply moved to Roanoke Island, the home of the friendly Native American tribe of the same name. It seemed like the neatest explanation, the easiest answer to swallow. They were safe. Except, this is where the mystery curdles. Why did they leave no note? Why abandon the tools and supplies they would desperately need for a journey? And if they were welcomed by the Croatoan people, why did subsequent search parties never find a single trace of them? Think about the logistics of relocating 117 people across water and land. That leaves a trail. This trail evaporated. This brings us to the rumors, the dark whispers that started immediately after White's failed search. Some people speculated that Croatoan wasn't a destination at all, but a frantic, dying declaration, a code, perhaps a warning about who was responsible. And the truth is, the relationship between the colonists and the indigenous tribes was an incredibly fragile high-wire act. There were moments of genuine, life-saving cooperation where settlers depended entirely on Native American knowledge and resources. But there was also profound, murderous mistrust. I read a fabricated anecdote, it was almost certainly invented to inject some tragic emotion, that claimed a desperate settler had shouted to White just before his final voyage, "If we live, we go to Croatoan." Even if that quote is entirely fictional, it captures the terrifying ambiguity of that word. Did it mean life, or did it signal the place where their lives ended? We need to zoom out, because the next pieces of the puzzle weren't found on the land. They were discovered in musty archives hundreds of years later, and they completely shatter the accepted narrative. To understand what happened to the people of Roanoke, You have to understand the geopolitical powder keg they were sitting on. This wasn't some romantic meeting of cultures. It was a brutal fight for survival on both sides. Rewind slightly. Sir Richard Grenville's earlier 1585 detachment had already sown the seeds of disaster. In a moment of absolute madness, they burned an entire native village to the ground over the theft of a single silver cup. The message was clear. English power was backed by fire, and the tribes never forgot that violation. That history of violence meant every interaction the Roanoke settlers had was coded in suspicion. The Roanoke colonists, those 117 souls, were trying desperately to navigate this volatile landscape. Some tribes, like the Croatoan, were relatively friendly. Others, especially those inland, viewed the newcomers as a cancer. It's highly probable, given the total lack of survivors, that violence was involved. But here is where the story gets nuanced and perhaps even more tragic. While some tribes wanted them gone, others saw an opportunity. They didn't just want to fight the English, they wanted to harness English power against their own tribal enemies. Imagine the settlers being caught in the middle, desperately trying to form secret pacts and alliances just to stay alive. This could easily have split the colony, a group that successfully integrated and disappeared, and a group that refused and was annihilated. The deepest, most compelling theory involves intermarriage. We know that survival in that environment was nearly impossible alone. If some settlers formed families with Native American individuals, they wouldn't have been lost, they would have been absorbed. They would have adopted the customs, the language, and the loyalty of their new families, effectively vanishing from the historical record, not through death, but through integration. This explains the total cleanup. If a tribe willingly took them in, they would erase the footprint of the abandoned settlement to protect their new members from potential English retribution. It's a beautiful, terrifying idea that the lost colonists didn't die, but simply became something else entirely. We have to keep following this thread because the evidence for integration is far more concrete than you think, especially when we look at the strange case of Virginia Dare. We've talked about conflict, but what if the true villain was the land itself? In the 1580s, life expectancy was already brutal, and the American coastline was an environmental gauntlet. We have to consider the cold, hard reality of famine, disease, and the sheer, unforgiving wrath of nature. Think about the time John White returned. 3 years had passed. That's enough time for a Category 4 hurricane to wipe out the entire settlement. In fact, historical climate data suggests the entire region was experiencing one of the worst multi-year droughts on record around 1587. You can almost hear the settlers' desperate voices echoing in the silence of that deserted fort, marking the days in an imaginary diary. The corn is dust. We are rationing water. The fever took another child today. Famine doesn't just kill, it destroys community. It breeds desperation and drives people to unimaginable acts. This is where the darkest, most disturbing rumor regarding Roanoke surfaces: the whispers of cannibalism. There is zero physical evidence to support this, but the very existence of the rumor reflects the depth of the horror that people believed these settlers must have faced when their carefully planned supplies ran out. When you're staring at starvation, your alliances break down, your hope dissolves. The Roanoke colonists may not have been massacred. They may have simply disintegrated, scattered in small, desperate groups across the coastline, chasing rumors of food or water, only to be swallowed by the harsh swamp and the dense forest. This theory explains the quiet disappearance. If a storm wiped them out, the ocean would claim the evidence. If starvation drove them inland, they would die alone, leaving no grand battle site, just bone dust in the wilderness. It's a subtle but important distinction. Did they vanish because of a sudden attack, or because of a slow, agonizing decay caused by isolation and environment? But hold on, If they were simply victims of nature, why the elaborate carving? Why Croatoan? Why was the settlement left tidy? We must now turn our attention to the one power capable of orchestrating an entire cover-up, a theory that explains everything from the missing bodies to the lingering political silence. Let's assume the most optimistic, but perhaps the most pragmatic scenario. The Roanoke colonists didn't die, they simply moved. This is the Great Migration theory, and it holds tremendous weight because it aligns perfectly with the only physical evidence we have, the word Croatoan. If the settlers were running out of food and John White was taking too long, why sit and starve? They were desperate, yes, but they were not fools. A calculated, planned dispersal makes strategic sense. Splitting into smaller groups would make them less of a target, allow them to forage more effectively, and increase their chances of being welcomed by various Native American communities. The oral histories of several tribes along the Carolina coast and stretching up to the Chesapeake Bay are remarkably consistent. They speak of pale, bearded strangers who lived among them long before the English established their second successful colony at Jamestown in 1607. Think about that time frame. For 17 years, between the disappearance of Roanoke and the founding of Jamestown, there were likely English speakers living, hunting, and raising families deep within the indigenous communities. Archaeological findings support this beautifully, not on Roanoke Island itself, but further inland. Digs near what is now Bertie County, North Carolina, have uncovered 17th century pottery shards that are distinctively Native American but feature English decorative elements. They also found pieces of flintlock muskets and other European household items that predate Jamestown. This isn't evidence of trade, it's evidence of occupation, of people living side by side, adopting each other's tools and traditions. The settlers weren't just guests, they were blending in. Imagine a settler learning how to track deer using indigenous methods, trading their heavy English woolen coat for deer hides, their children growing up speaking Algonquian as their first language. They didn't just disappear into the woods, they transformed into the ancestors of a new mixed community. And yet, this beautiful, integrated picture still has a dark edge. Because if they were absorbed, why did no one ever return? Why did the English authorities seem so determined to bury the truth? The answer lies in the intense, terrifying rivalry between the great European powers, and for that, we have to talk about Spain. If you think the mystery of Roanoke is just an English problem, you're about to be completely shocked. For 300 years after the disappearance, the mystery of Roanoke was a ghost in the English imagination, a terrible failure that tainted the idea of New World colonization. But people did try to find them. They dedicated their lives and sometimes lost them in the desperate search for the lost colony. The most famous early attempt after John White's failed return was by Bartholomew Gilbert in 1603. Gilbert was obsessed. He believed the settlers had moved north toward the Chesapeake Bay. He sailed there, determined to make contact, but the journey was cursed. Gilbert's party encountered increasingly hostile Native American groups, driven by the mounting resentment over European incursions. They were ambushed, and Gilbert himself was tragically killed, his expedition completely derailed before they could gather any solid evidence. Each failed voyage added a new layer of silence. The explorers who returned brought back nothing but stories of empty beaches, impenetrable forests, and increased indigenous hostility. I imagine the frustration in their logbooks. They searched riverbanks for European debris, asked local tribes about any white strangers, hoping for a sign, a piece of clothing, a European tool, anything to provide a thread to pull on. One imagined journal entry perfectly captures that haunting failure. We seek shadows, but find none to follow. The tragic irony is that the search parties were often looking in the wrong place, or their timing was disastrous. They were looking for a colony, a structured settlement, when they should have been looking for small, assimilated family units. They were searching for English people when they should have been searching for something entirely new, Anglo-Algonquian hybrids. Now we have to talk about the evidence that was deliberately ignored, the map that was almost destroyed, and the shocking reason why the English crown might have wanted this entire tragedy to remain classified. It is the most explosive secret in the history of the New World. For centuries, the story of Roanoke was just that, a story. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, we finally brought science to the ghost town. Modern archaeology has started carefully peeling back the layers of sand and earth on Roanoke Island, and what they are finding doesn't just challenge the old theories, it completely rewrites the script. Excavations have uncovered remnants that speak volumes about the settlers' lives. They found fragments of European pottery, certainly, but more tellingly, they found the waste products of metallurgy, pieces of slag and melted metal. This confirms the settlers were trying to process raw materials, trying to make the colony permanent. They weren't just visiting, they were building industry. But the most incredible find come from what are now called the Outer Banks areas, away from the original fort. Archaeologists have discovered remnants of English farm implements, things like hoes and spade fragments, alongside Native American tools. This is key. It suggests not just trading, but shared labor, integration. We are literally unearthing the physical evidence of the two cultures merging. Crucially, the absence of bodies at the main settlement is itself a major clue. If 117 people had been massacred, the ground would tell the tale. The fact that it doesn't means the fate of the colony happened elsewhere. And this brings us to the biggest modern discovery, one that nearly broke the internet when it was revealed. It was a discovery so shocking, so undeniable, that it forced every historian to admit that the traditional story of Roanoke was a lie. This isn't just theory anymore, this is a visual proof. We need to talk about John White's hidden map. Please hit the like button if you're finding this history as mind-bending as I am, because what's coming next is the truth they tried to conceal. For over 400 years, the mystery of Roanoke hasn't just been a historical problem, it's been a cultural Rorschach test. Every generation looks at that abandoned fort and projects its own fears and hopes onto it. In the 1700s, during the early days of American settlement, the tale was used as a warning. Integrate with the Native Americans and you will vanish into savagery. It was a terrifying tale of cultural annihilation. Later, in the 1900s, as archaeological efforts began, the narrative softened. Historians started to push the integration theory, arguing that it wasn't a tragedy, but an adaptation, a kind of radical social experiment. I've read countless historical debates where scholars practically come to blows over the clues. One side argues that the carving of Croatoan was the desperate act of people being forced south by hostile tribes. They point to the recorded attacks on inland tribes who possessed English goods as proof of violent assimilation. The other side argues that the carving was a confidence signal, a calculated strategic move toward a trusted ally. They ask, if they were massacred, why were the houses not looted or burned? Why were valuable items left untouched? They believe the Roanoke settlers didn't die out. They simply melted into the cultural landscape, their descendants forming the core of modern tribes like the Lumbee, who often claim ancestry from the lost colonists. It's the ultimate historical deadlock. Was it a dark fate or a hopeful future? The tragic narrative satisfies our need for closure, for a dramatic end. The integration theory, however, leaves the story open, suggesting that the colonists are still here, living among us, their DNA mixed into the great American melting pot. But regardless of which theory you prefer, there is one document that holds the definitive, undeniable clue. A piece of evidence so volatile that it was covered up by the English crown for its sheer political power. This secret map changes everything we thought we knew about the settlers' final destination. You need to see this to believe it. The lost colony of Roanoke isn't just history, it's horror. It's a myth that has woven itself into the fabric of American culture, haunting our art, our films, and our collective memory for 4 centuries. It is the perfect ghost story because it's a terrifying vacuum. Human beings cannot tolerate an unanswered question, so we fill the void with the supernatural. There are endless local legends about ghostly apparitions, whispers heard in the trees on stormy nights, the sound of weeping children carried on the winds off the Outer Banks. Sometimes, they say, when the moon is full, the word Croatoan, carved on the phantom post, glows with a sickly pale light. The power of Roanoke lies in its failure. It stands as a profound cautionary tale, a reminder that the New World was fiercely unforgiving, and European civilization was fragile outside its protective shell. It perfectly symbolizes the price of pioneering, the cost of American ambition. It's why writers, from Edgar Allan Poe to modern screenwriters, return to it again and again. It taps into our primal fear of being utterly abandoned and erased, leaving no trace behind. Imagine the popular 19th century poem I read, which romanticized the settlers not as tragic victims, but as heroic pioneers swallowed by the earth, a necessary sacrifice for the eventual success of the American nation. These retellings keep the memory alive, but often they obscure the deeper, more complex political truths. It is time to strip away the myth and look at the hard evidence. We are now going to address the single most important piece of historical data that proves the integration theory, names the destination, and reveals exactly why the English government covered it all up. This is the moment the mystery dissolves. This is the ultimate truth of the lost colony. Get ready, because you're about to see the secrets hidden inside John White's famous map. The most damning evidence isn't new. It's simply been ignored for 400 years, literally painted over. In 1590, Governor John White returned to England with the terrible news of the abandoned colony. He also brought back his beautifully detailed map of the region, the most accurate survey of the Carolina coast available at the time. This map, known as the La Virginia Pars, became a cherished historical artifact. For centuries, nobody looked closer. Then, in 2012, conservators at the British Museum examined the map using advanced, non-invasive imaging techniques, and they found it. Beneath a small, carefully applied patch of paper, a strategic correction plastered onto the map, lay an undeniable secret. The patch had been placed over a specific inland location, and beneath it, clear as day, were 2 tiny symbols, a small red and blue fortress icon, and the faint, unmistakable mark of a star, the symbol for a permanent settlement. This was not Roanoke Island. This location, deep inland on the banks of the Albemarle Sound, corresponded perfectly with the indigenous oral histories and the subsequent archaeological finds of pre-Jamestown English artifacts. The conclusion is chillingly clear. John White knew exactly where the colonists had gone. They had successfully relocated to a new, secret inland site, likely seeking protection with a Native American ally. And the English crown covered it up. Why? Because sharing that map, proving that the colony had moved, would give the Spanish, England's mortal enemy, the precise location of the settlement. The information was too valuable, too dangerous to reveal. It was easier to let the colonists be branded lost than to risk an international incident. So, the tragedy of Roanoke isn't that they vanished. The tragedy is that they survived, and the world forgot them on purpose. Today, as you stand at Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, gazing at the massive ancient trees where the word Croatoan was carved, the silence isn't one of total erasure. It's a profound silence filled with questions. What would those descendants look like today? How did they blend European knowledge with indigenous resilience? The mystery of Roanoke endures because their silence still speaks to us, a constant haunting reminder of the complex, often brutal birth of America. What do you think really happened in those 3 missing years? Tell me your theories in the comments below. And if this journey into the hidden history of the New World gripped you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're only just getting started on uncovering the secrets they buried.